I'm here with my partner and great friend and a person I respect a lot, Senator Al Simpson. And as you know, we served as co-chair of the President's Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. When the President asked Al and me to serve as co-chairs, after discussing with the President a number of questions we had and making sure that he was committed to this process, we both enthusiastically accepted the challenge, and we accepted it because we were concerned about the future of this country, and we were particularly concerned about the future for our children and our 14 grandchildren. Once the commission was assembled, our goal from day one was to put politics aside, to build up some trust, and to begin an adult conversation here in Washington on the perils of these deficits. It's the same conversation that every single family, every business, every university, every state, and every local government has been having over the last several years. Well, we had just such a conversation over 9 months during 2010, and despite the consensus predictions that Al and I were on a suicide mission, a commission that was doomed to failure, our team, and that's what we really became. We became a team of some of us elected, some of us appointed, but a team of concerned American citizens that came out with a plan that took some bold steps to reduce the deficit by $4 trillion over this next decade. And we got the support of a supermajority of our membership. We got the support of 60% of our members, 11 out of 18, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 1 independent. And we proved it was possible to get a bipartisan consensus on a serious, comprehensive fiscal plan. We called the report the moment of truth. The commission report got high praise across the political perspective, from the New York Times to the Washington Post to the Wall Street Journal to the National Review. Nobody liked everything in it. Al doesn't like everything in it. I don't like everything in it. But everyone agreed it was a serious, responsible, sensible proposal. But Al and I didn't get in this deal in order to get a bunch of good editorials that we could clip out and show to our grandchildren. We got in this deal to do something real, something serious, to get something done. That's why we're back. That's why, as Al said, we're like this stink bomb that won't go away. We're back here today to launch the Moment of Truth project, which we hope will build on the momentum provided by the Fiscal Commission to jumpstart the enactment of a comprehensive plan. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of the President and the leadership in Congress, the leadership of both parties in both houses, to get this done, to make the tough choices, to provide the leadership necessary to deal with this issue honestly, openly, transparently, and candidly. And it's up to this leadership to push the process along towards a bipartisan agreement on a serious, comprehensive fiscal plan. Al and I, through this Moment of Truth project, and with the help and support of the other members of our commission that voted for this, we plan to keep the heat on these leaders to do just that. I want to personally thank the 5 senators who supported this plan, Senators Conrad, Coburn, Crapo, Durbin, and Gregg, and Chairman Spratt, the chairman of the House Budget Committee. The 4 senators who are still serving have been working together on a plan based on our recommendations, and they have been joined in this effort by Senators Chambliss and Warner, who have done absolutely yeoman's work in building support for a serious, comprehensive fiscal plan. In the final report that was published by the Commission, we said the following: we offer this plan as a starting point for a serious national conversation. The Moment of Truth Project will follow through on this goal by encouraging Congress and the President to use the Fiscal Commission proposal as a basis for their discussion. We will continue to bang away at all our elected leaders to produce a solution that is as serious and as comprehensive as the Commission proposal. I should just add before turning it over to my partner that if our Commission was a test case for showing that serious problems can be resolved with a divided government, then we have offered resounding proof that the two parties can work together for the good of our country. Al?
Very good. I like that. You worked that over, didn't you? Let me tell you, I couldn't do this without this wonderful gentleman at my side. It was a thrill when Joe Biden called me in January of 2010 and said, "Al, I got a real deal for you here. You're going to be the co-chair of a national commission." I said, "Great, let me bring my wife Ann in so she can laugh along with me, Joe." And we went ahead and I said, "Who's my co-chair?" And they said, "Erskine Bowles." And the first call I had was from Elizabeth and Bob Dole saying this is one of the finest men we've ever known and worked with in North Carolina. So then we said we got to see the president because we want to be sure everything is on the table, everything, including the new health care bill. And the president said, "That's right, that's fair," and so off we went. It's like an old ad, those of us who were age of mine, that was used to say, they laughed when I sat down to play, but they're not laughing now because this baby is out there. It ain't going away. It will never leave because times will come when the pressures build and they'll look around and say, well, what do we do with the big stuff? Medicare, Medicaid, defense. And you've got to put one word in front of Social Security. The word is solvency. Doesn't have anything to do with cutting out old ladies and old men and torturing children and throwing bedpans out of hospitals. Has to do with making a marvelous system that people are totally dependent upon in many ways and make it solvent so it doesn't go broke. And in the year, if you don't do anything, and there are plenty of people in this city that hope and pray we don't do anything with Social Security, then when you waddle up to the window, or somebody of your kin waddles up to the window in 2037, you get a check for 22% less. And that's the law. It's called "This baby pays out only payable benefits and not scheduled benefits." So when you get that little slip of paper and it says scheduled benefits, forget it. If there's not there, you get the payable benefit. So there are a lot of distortions. This city is filled with people with sharpshoot ideas. Everything here in this city is based in use of a deft blend of emotion, fear, guilt, or racism. It's how you pass or kill a bill and work it over. It works, has worked for years. But anyway, we started off, we have a wonderful crew. You see their names. This is a great thing for this panel to be here and share themselves with you. This is the most frustrating, legislating is the most frustrating, irritating, cumbersome, sloppy work. And it is work, and it ain't pretty. But as an old Westerner said, if you hire on to be a cowboy, you can't complain if you draw a bucking bronco, and that's what this critter is for us. But we're here to listen, and the reason we're doing it is clear. We have 14 reasons. He has 8 grandchildren, I have 6. That's who this is about, those people, not us. And not anyone over 70. The worst letters I get are people over 75, drilling my teeth, punching my eyeballs out, and they're not even going to be hurt in this process. It's young people who will be hurt, and their lifestyle will not be the same. So it took us 3 months to work through trust, and we have the trust. We watched Andy Stern work with Tom Coburn. We watched our committee chairs, Republican and Democrat alike, and we established a trust. So I would only say to you, it's easy to get this across to the American people. They may not understand it here, but out in the land where Erskine and I go, and we've been all over this country, the two of us, this is just a temporary respite from our witness protection program. We do try to show up at various occasions and sporadic appearances. But let me tell you, I'll tell you what they understand. They say, well, if we could do here what they do at the kitchen table, well, I'll tell you what they do at the kitchen table. They look at each other and say, if you spend more than you earn, you lose your butt. And the other one is, if you spend $1 and have to borrow 40 cents, you must be stupid. And that's where this country is right now. We borrow 40 cents for every buck we spend. And how long does anybody believe that you can sustain a course like that with any kind of common sense? One final note about Social Security. We are trying to restore the solvency. Let me just say to you, when it started, the average age of death, maturity, whatever you want, 63. That's why they set the retirement age at 65. That was the beginning of the first great adventure. It is not a retirement program. It had nothing to do with retirement. It was an income supplement. Read it. Read about what was to happen with the trust funds. If the money built up, to get the good paper from the U.S., top stuff, full faith and credit. And now we have a situation where the life expectancy is 77. And we're doing a horrible thing here. We're recommending that the life expectancy, or that the age of retirement, goes to 68 by the year 2050. I think somebody could probably get their affairs in order to figure out, because it's going to be, it's already 66. It's going to be 67 by 1927. And we think that people can figure that out, that in the year 2050 it will be 68. And then one final thing, as you get into the emotion of Social Security, and there will be plenty of it, is this. There were 16 people paying into this system when I was a freshman at the University of Wyoming in 1950. Then there were 10 people paying in 10 years later. Now there are 3 people paying in and 1 taking out. And in 10 years, there will be 2 people paying in and 1 taking out. And how long do you think that kind of system can sustain itself? So let's all sober up, come to the table, communion assembled, and let's hear it. But let's hear facts. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but nobody's entitled to their own facts. That was Moynihan's great comment. It was good enough for me. Then I have 2 quotes for you. Very short. One is from some guy named Cicero, 55 BC. Let me tell you what he said. The budget should be balanced, the treasury should be refilled, public debt should be reduced, the arrogance of officialdom should be tempered and controlled, and assistance to foreign lands should be curtailed lest Rome become bankrupt. That was old Cicero. Here's what Abe Lincoln said in one quick paragraph at the age of 29. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reaches, it must spring up amongst us. If destruction is our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. And finally, money. Gold is the money of kings. Silver is the money of gentlemen. Barter is the money of peasants. And debt is the money of slaves. And that's where we are. And if you look through the entire history of this country, everything that came to a crisis had to do with reducing debt right back to the days of George Washington. So hang on tight. We'll be around.
Best partner in the world. We have 2 members of our commission. I don't know 2 people that I admire and respect more than I do these 2 leaders. And leaders are what they are. They are leaders in the finest sense of that word. They are also 2 of the most principled people I've ever had a chance to work with. They're going to speak to us before the panel starts. It's Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma and Senator Mike Crapo of Idaho. Tom?
Well, let me just say, first of all, I appreciate very much the work that these two gentlemen did in leading the Fiscal Commission. The America I know understands that when we as a nation face a problem and we come together, there's not anything we can't solve. And the only part left out of that is explaining the degree of difficulty we're in and the leadership that's necessary to bring our nation together to make the hard choices that are in front of us. I believe the Deficit Commission recognized that under their leadership, and I believe that we can solve our problems. But I don't believe we can solve our problems as a nation divided. And therefore, I cast a vote in favor of what we did in spite of some very difficult areas I have with the Commission report, because we don't have the time nor the opportunity to do it all my way. And so I think that the greatest thing to come out of this report is that it's an example to the American public that we can, in fact, solve our problems when at this level we can agree to do something. And I'm hopeful for our future. I would leave you a couple of comments so that you understand the urgency. Historically, our country has paid about 6% on our debt. We're paying around 2% now. If, in fact, historical interest rates return, we have an additional $640 billion a year we will have to come up with right now. That is an impossible situation for us. And so the ultimate answer for us is we ought to be making the changes that our country needs to be made while we have the opportunity to decide what those changes will be, rather than wait until those changes are dictated to us. And so I would thank you both for your efforts on behalf of the Commission and the country, and my hope is that we'll continue this work through the Senate.
Thank you, Senator. This is a real leader for sure. Senator Crapo?
Thank you very much, Erskine and Alan, not only for being here today, but for your incredible leadership on this incredibly important issue. And thank you to all of you for being here as well. I want to join with our chairman of the commission, as well as the other senators who supported it, and Tom Coburn, in delivering the important message of the day. And if there's really one message that I would hope everyone will leave here with today, it is that the time for gridlock is over. We do not have time to continue to go around the bush and around the bush and around the bush, debating and fighting about our specific, perfect solutions. As has been said by everyone who's spoken today, there was a lot in this plan that was hard to swallow for every single member of the commission who voted for it. But there was much more in this plan that was hard to leave behind. In fact, I think it was Kent Conrad who said the only thing worse than voting in favor of this plan is voting against this plan. Many of the economists who addressed us as we were deliberating as a commission said probably the most important thing this commission could do would be to come forward with a plan that could get the Congress and the American people behind it. Because if we will simply, as a nation, adopt a plan that is long-term in focus and can get us on the pathway toward dealing with our debt crisis, it would have a bigger impact on our economy than maybe any specific element or the plan in itself in its entirety. I have to admit that I, among many, when the commission began, was somewhat dubious. And then when I was asked to be a member of it, I was even more dubious about just whether this really had merit and where it would end up. But as we deliberated, it became evident to me that this is one of those times in our history when Americans have to come together and we have to set aside partisan differences and other differences and agree to solve a critical national solution. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff can say that the greatest threat to our national security is our national debt, we need to pay attention. And I'm not going to give you a lot of statistics. I think you've got folks who are going to be here to lay out the specific details of why we are saying this. But we are not facing a long fuse on this issue. It's been very common for people in the political arena to say, you know, if we don't stop spending so much and if we don't stop driving up our debt, then our children and our grandchildren are going to pay the price. It's not our children and our grandchildren only who will deal with this issue. It is every one of us in this room. It's everyone in America today. We are talking about a matter of a short few years at best if we don't stop our current direction and our current policy in this country, that we will face a debt crisis. And I think Dave Cody may talk to you about a little more about that, and probably a number of the others here. And so quickly in summary, what did the Commission do that caused me to go from being dubious to a supporter? First of all, it brought together a consensus that we must act, and we must act now. And it developed the groundwork and the framework for justifying that claim. Secondly, it was comprehensive. We looked at everything. Everything has to be on the table. There cannot be any more portions of the solution that are simply set aside as being too important or too critical to be a part of it. We looked at spending. We divided it into discretionary and entitlement spending. And there are solutions in the plan to deal with each. We looked at tax policy, and I thought wonderfully, instead of getting into the age-old debate over whether we should raise taxes or lower taxes, we talked about the fact that our tax code could not probably be made much less fair, less or more complex, more expensive to comply with, and more competitive to our international circumstances, or more anti-competitive with regard to our posture in the world. And we looked at reforming the tax code to make it more fair, more efficient, less expensive to comply with, and most importantly, to make America more competitive globally and generate the kind of dynamic response in our economy that will generate a stronger revenue response to help us achieve a solution on the revenue side of the equation. We looked at process, because everybody knows that if you set out a plan to move forward, members of Congress are going to try to get around it. Some of the best tricks we have today are to declare something a national emergency and we don't even have to count it. There are other parts of the situation of the budget process in Congress that we need to deal with. But we focused on closing the process loopholes and creating process strengths to assure the world that if we adopt this plan, we will stick with it. And what does it do in the end? In addition to dealing with spending, with revenue policy, and with process, it takes the curve that, if you haven't read the report, is in the very first chart in the report, and which shows an exploding national debt that will drive us into economic disaster, and it bends it down. And it literally takes the delta out of the curve that is going like this and bends it down, ultimately to a balanced budget and to a reduction of our debt problems. That's what we need to come together and achieve it as Americans. Last comment in terms of just some perspective. We're fighting in Congress this week, and in the next 48 hours or so, we will vote on several proposals to cut somewhere between $6 billion and $60 billion worth of spending out of this year's budget. And it's important that we are having that debate, and I hope that we will make major strides in making those kinds of spending reforms. But this plan cuts $4 trillion off of our national debt over the next decade. That is the scope of difference that we need to be thinking about and focusing on as we look at the crisis our nation faces. I just want to conclude by again thanking our chairman, all of the others who will be on the panel today, the other commission members who have been here, and all of you, because it's you who will help us get this message across and, if possible, help us get this solution put into place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Thank you, Senator Conrad. We have two other members of the commission who would like to address you before we begin the panel. We have with us today Senator Conrad, who is chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. If it had not been for Senator Conrad and Senator Gregg, there would have never been a commission. They are the ones that prevailed upon the president to form this commission, and they are the ones that led to the recommendations that we made. We cannot thank you enough for your support, for your leadership, for your guidance, and for your knowledge of how we tackle this very difficult task. We'll first hear from Senator Conrad, and then we'll hear from Dave Cody, who is the chairman and CEO of Honeywell, also a member of a commission. Mr. Cody brought to this commission a sense of realism from the business world that kept us out of politics and kept us on the path toward real discussion about real solutions to these big problems. Senator Conrad, and then Mr. Cody.
Well, I'm going to be very brief because you've got a long program ahead of you. First of all, to thank Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson for courage and character and real leadership. And I think when the history of this period is written, that they will come across as heroes to the American people. So please join me in thanking them for all they have done. Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson. Now, what is this all about? Well, very simply, we are borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that we spend. We are borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that we spend. That cannot continue much longer. If you look at the history of the United States, we are spending as a share of the economy more than we have at any time in the last 60 years. On the other side of the equation, the revenue as a share of our national economy is the lowest it has been in 60 years. The result is that we have the biggest deficit we have had in 60 years. And we are on a course that will lead to a financial crisis. The truth is, we're asked all the time, when might that occur? The truth is, no one knows. The one thing we do know with certainty is that we are hurtling towards the financial cliff. We are adding $1.5 trillion to the debt this year. We are adding $1 trillion to the gross debt every year for the next 10 years. You think about where we were 10 years ago. We had a balanced budget. We were paying down the debt. What a transformation, and all in the wrong way. Look, for those who say, we really don't have to worry about this, we have just had a study done by two of the most distinguished economists in the country. They came back, Carmen Reinhart, University of Maryland, Ken Rogoff at Harvard. They looked at 200 years of financial history in 44 countries. Their conclusion is when a country gets to a gross debt of more than 90% of the GDP, their future economic growth is substantially diminished. That means future opportunity is diminished. Future job growth is diminished. The quality of life of the people of the country is diminished. Remember their conclusion. When you get to a gross debt of more than 90% of GDP, future economic growth is substantially reduced. What is the debt of the United States at the end of this year? The gross debt? 100% of the gross domestic product of the country. That's why this matters. This is not numbers on a page. This is about the economic future of America, the economic strength of America, and when you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs say the #1 security threat to America is the national debt, we ought to sit up and take notice and pay attention and act. That is what the Commission has given us. They have given us a blueprint to action, one that is balanced. Look, I was part of this Commission. I voted for the report. We had 11 members who did, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent. 11 of 18, that's more than 60%. Normally, even in Washington, 60% carries the day. But this Commission, we had to get 14 of the 18 to agree. Pretty tall hurdle. But you know, it doesn't matter so much that we didn't get 14. What does matter is that we laid out a plan, that we got 11 people to agree, and that plan, however imperfect, And yes, it's imperfect. There are parts of this plan I hate. Senator Durbin called me the night before the vote and said, Kent, how are you going to vote? I said, I'm going to vote yes. He said, why are you going to vote that way? I said, the only thing worse than being for this plan is being against it. Because history is going to judge us. History is going to judge whether we had the courage and the character and the vision to stand up for America's future. And we're all going to be judged. And those who take a walk, those who turn away, those who don't have the gumption to stand up are going to be judged very, very harshly. That's my belief. So look, we owe a deep debt of gratitude to Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson. I can't think of better leadership, a better example of leadership than I saw in the work they did on this commission, bringing together 11 people with very different views, very different philosophies, but joined by a common commitment to get this debt threat under control. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Erskine. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this would not have happened without the leadership of that man. Dave, you want to come up and talk to us now, just for a minute?
The seeds of the next recession have already been planted. Whatever politics any of us may have, the debt problem is real. From a net debt position of $9 trillion and 60% of GDP today, we grow in 10 years to $20 trillion and 90% of GDP. And that's accompanied by an interest bill of $1 trillion a year. Now, to put $1 trillion into perspective, because many of us deal with millions and billions, $1 trillion just sounds like another number. If you had spent $1 million a day since Jesus Christ was born 2,010 years ago, you still would not have spent $1 trillion. And that will be our annual interest bill. It's unconscionable. And that $20 trillion in debt could be optimistic because it assumes nominal GDP growth of 4.6% a year for 10 years, and it assumes that Medicare and Medicaid growth moderates from 10% a year in the last decade to 6% in the current one. It's unsustainable, and as Ben Stein once observed, if something is unsustainable, it will stop. The question is how, because it will happen in one of two ways. The first is to do it today, thoughtfully, proactively, the way a great country addresses the tough problems in life. The second is to wait until the bond market forces you to do it, like Greece and Portugal did. At that point, we'll be wishing we had done it the easy way, thoughtfully and proactively, like a great country does. The bond market seems like an amorphous and impersonal thing, where only fat cat bankers and people like me get hurt. That's not the case. Everyone gets hurt, and here's why. Almost half our debt is held outside the United States. In other words, foreign countries have lent us the money, about half of the money, to live beyond our means. China alone has loaned us about $1 trillion. As our debt mounts, these foreign creditors or bankers get nervous. They get nervous about getting their money back, and they start asking for a higher price on their money. Higher price is another way of saying higher interest rates. As these interest rates go up, all other interest rates go up also. So now house loans are 11%, car loans are 15%, and everyday small town and large town Americans suffer. It's Main Street that gets hurt because we didn't have the guts to act when we should have. And when that bond market turns, it's not like we get advance warning. It's not a case of watching interest rates just tick up 10 basis points a month for 10 months and then plotting out at what point the crisis occurs. It doesn't work that way. When the herd turns against you, it happens overnight and unpredictably. There is no warning, and it can be severe. You need look no further back than a couple years ago to recall how suddenly and shockingly the crisis was upon us and the extraordinary actions that we had to take. It will feel the same way, only worse. We need to do something to make good decisions, or Americans will suffer. Inaction is also a decision. It's a decision to let the tragedy of the bond market turn hurt all Americans before we do something. The easiest decision in the world is to do nothing. It's what kills companies, and it's what can kill a country. Political will does matter. Some countries in the world think our time is past, that we were great once, that we prefer our entitlements and our arguing to actually doing the tough things in life anymore. To use a sports analogy, that we're proud of having won the Olympics 40 years ago, but we don't want to train so hard anymore. I do believe in the spirit of the American people. It's very easy for people to just focus on their personal situation until they understand the bigger American picture. Most Americans I've met want to know that their kids and their grandkids have a good shot at a better life than they had. Each generation wants to know that they are passing on the opportunity for a better life. Now, there's a lot of discussion about polls showing that Americans don't want spending reductions or tax increases. I don't think we should be surprised by that. It is, I think, actually pretty logical. However, I don't feel anyone has actually told Americans the entire story either, about how there are just too many of us baby boomers retiring and that we will literally crush the system. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security commitments we've made will destroy future generations' opportunity to lead a better life because they will still be paying for us. There are just too many of us. No one has told them that you would have to raise taxes on the top 2 tax brackets to over 100%. An impossible thing to do, to pay for it. That talking about foreign aid or earmarks or waste is like chasing ants and ignoring elephants. We need to be honest with Americans and appeal to our higher nature, our desire to pass on to our kids the chance of a better life. The Senate could be the crucible where that American dream is preserved. The dream where every generation passes on a better life to the next one, where we make the tough decisions early when they are in fact easier, rather than waiting until there's an abrupt recession caused by a bond market turn of the herd and people can't get credit, can't get jobs, can't pay their debts. Where we show the world that our time is not past, that we are still a vibrant and dynamic country, that we haven't forgotten how to compete, how to work hard like our parents taught us, how to do the tough things in life, that we haven't forgotten our unwritten promise to future generations that their lives would be better than ours. Through my work on the Fiscal Commission, I was astounded early on at the amount of distrust that existed between the two political parties. Generally, it seems we would rather revel in our discordant pluralism, and from that cacophony, decisions unfold, or they don't, and by and large, that argumentative, querulous process works. There are those times, though, when it's more important to pull together than it is to pull apart, when true leadership asserts itself and the right decisions do get made. This Congress will be deciding between being the Smoot-Hawley of the 21st century, making the wrong decisions at the worst possible time, or being the Congress that launched a U.S. technology revival in response to Sputnik. While I was astounded early on at the lack of trust that existed between political parties, in the end I was even more impressed by how 5 senators from across the political spectrum came together and voted for the proposal, recognizing that while imperfect to all of us, it's highly better than where we are and supremely better than where we could be. As an American, I sincerely hope that the Senate can rally the political courage to tell Americans the truth and to act to save that American dream. And it's been said many times, but it's still true: no guts, no glory. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Ed Lorenzen, the Executive Director of the Moment of Truth Project. As Erskine said, the purpose of the project is to build on the lessons learned by and the momentum created by the Fiscal Commission to try to move towards a bipartisan action on our deficit and debt. So with that in mind, our panel discussion today is going to discuss the Fiscal Commission and Fiscal Commission report as a model for bipartisan action. The panel will be moderated by David Wessel, who is the economics editor of the Wall Street Journal and writes the weekly Capital column. And he will introduce the panelists. As a housekeeping note, we are going to be passing out note cards for anyone who has questions for the panelists to write them down. We'll be collecting them and asking those questions during the panel. David?
Thank you very much. I've never been to a revival meeting before in the Senate office building, but now I know what it's like. When I came in, I saw those cookies and apples in the back. I thought, oh my gosh, Bowles and Simpson are going to have a bake sale to reduce the federal debt. I'm really surprised that there's not some little styrofoam cup that you're supposed to put money in, but it's not too late for that. Not too late to do that. I'm Dave Wessel from the... I'm sorry. I hope you heard all my jokes. I won't repeat them. I'm David Wessel from the Wall Street Journal. I'm joined here by Jeff Liebman, who's a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School and who worked in both the Clinton and the Obama White Houses on economic matters, and David Gergen, who's worked, I think, for every administration since Abraham Lincoln. Is that right? No, seriously, David Gergen, who's a political analyst for CNN and has served as an advisor to 4 presidents of both parties. And to his left, Donald Marin, who's the director of the Tax Policy Center sponsored by the Urban Institute and the Brookings Institution, and a visiting professor at Georgetown's Public Policy Institute. He worked at the Council of Economic Advisors in a Republican administration and served briefly as the acting director of the Congressional Budget Office. And I thought I would start by reading something I found useful that the current director of the Congressional Budget Office said in remarks he made to the National Association of Business Economics just this week. He had 4 observations about the federal budget. 1, if current policies are continued, the gap between spending and revenues will remain very large, even after the economy returns to normal. 2nd, fiscal policy cannot be put on a sustainable path just by eliminating waste and inefficiency. The changes that are needed will significantly affect popular programs or people's tax payments or both. 3rd, there are important benefits to deciding quickly what to do, but difficult trade-offs in deciding quickly how soon to implement those changes. And finally, and particularly relevant, there is more focus in Washington on federal budget problems today than there has been since the late 1990s. And that focus has led to a range of proposals for tackling the problems, one of which is on the table today. I'm going to ask each of my panelists here, the 3 panelists, to speak for 5 or 6 minutes about their reaction to the plan. And then I'm going to ask Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson if they have any reactions. I might ask a couple of questions. And then we'll turn it over to you for questions. And I understand cards are being passed. If you have a question and don't have a card, raise your hand and somebody will miraculously appear with a card. So David, can I start with you? You don't have to. Don't make the mistake I did. Push the button.
Well, good afternoon. And it is a privilege to be with you today, and especially to be with Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, 2 colleagues and friends from the past whom I think have done really heroic work. And I salute you for launching this new initiative in the spirit of the 9/11 Commission when it was so important that Lee Hamilton and Tom Kean, as co-chairs of that commission, continued the work beyond the life of the commission, and really I think were a powerful influence on moving forward many of the recommendations of the commission. And clearly there's a model here for what's going on today. I think I was asked to talk about the politics of these questions a little bit. We've been hearing about the economics. And it's obvious that the politics are very tough. If they were easy, this would have been done long ago. But we've been kicking the can down the road for a long time because our political leaders have been so afraid to take on these issues, and the public has not been fully prepared to embrace the kind of solutions that are there. It's important to understand that from a political science point of view, since the New Deal, political scientists have generally established and bought into the proposition that Americans are philosophically conservative, but operationally liberal. That Americans tend to embrace the notions of a small, lean government, a vigorous private enterprise system, individual thrift, individual self-reliance, but when it comes to the actual operations of government, people vote again and again for the programs. And they want to keep their taxes down but have all the programs. And you have to break out of that syndrome in order to make it. I think that's one of the tallest orders here politically, is to get beyond and begin to change the context in which political decisions are made. So if you can change the environment, the political landscape, the political environment, it's a lot easier for the political leaders to act. And partly their responsibility to change the landscape, but groups like this can often make a major difference. There is no question that there can be a path to embracing the central tenets of the Simpson-Bowles Commission through a bipartisan effort in Washington with the Congress and the White House. No question that there can be a path. But I would say it's the only way we're going to find a path is through bipartisanship. Some years ago, one of my mentors in life, whom I continue to miss today, Pat Moynihan, when I was in the Clinton White House, would send lots and lots of notes to me. This is around health care, trying to emphasize and help me understand that the milestones in major social legislation and major economic legislation in this country, stretching back to the New Deal, have always been done in a bipartisan fashion. That the big breakthroughs we see in social policy, going back to Social Security, including Medicare, Civil Rights I, Civil Rights II, the tax reform bill of 1986, were all passed with supermajorities in the Senate, in which there was a buy-in from both parties. And I think one of the regrets that many of us still have about the health care bill last year was it was not passed in a bipartisan fashion, and as a result, there's a lot of instability, and it remains a political football. But the major milestones that were put into place were done with bipartisan support in the same spirit that the Warren Court worked on when they issued the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. What was important, critically important to the Chief Justice, was to ensure that every justice on the court supported the decision. If it had been 5-4, it would have torn the country apart. But because it was 9-0, it brought everybody together, and that's what's needed here in order to get the country's buy-in and to allow both parties to proceed. And it can be done. And I think that one of the relevant models that is certainly one here is talked about in the White House is 1983 on the Social Security agreement that was forged in 1983. A Republican president who held the Senate, there's an analogy here that's very close. A Republican president held the Senate, and the House was in the hands of the Democratic Party. Everybody understood that Social Security needed to be fixed. No one wanted to fix it. It was too third rail, all that other kind of language that goes into this. It was too explosive. What essentially happened? There were very quiet talks that got underway between the White House, the Republican White House, and the Democratic leadership of the House, starting with Tip O'Neill. Those talks proceeded in a way that began to sense maybe there is room here for an agreement. And once they had understood that, they then went to the leadership in the Senate, especially Bob Dole and Pat Moynihan on the Finance Committee, and they began working out the outlines of a deal. There were a lot of conversations between a fellow named Richard Darman, who was Jim Baker's chief deputy. I was in that White House. And we had a Greenspan commission that was sort of the overall, but a lot of the negotiations went on with the White House actively involved behind the scenes with members to begin cutting a deal. And there were a period of 2 weeks in early 1983 when there were private conversations held at the home of Jim Baker up on Foxhall, behind the scenes, nobody knew they were going on, in which basically an agreement was reached. And the whole notion of the Greenspan Commission and what was agreed upon was the same kind of things that are in the Simpson-Bowles proposal. It was hard then, it can be hard now, but it can be done. And strikingly, one of the people who was very helpful in reaching that deal in 1983 was a young 27-year-old who was working for Tip O'Neill, who was his policy director, and his name was Jack Lew. And Jack Lew, as you know, is now the budget director for the Obama administration. So there are people who understand that the way to put this together. There's another example I'll deal less with, but one of the most famous acts in American history was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was first proposed by a beleaguered Harry Truman who had lost the House and lost the Senate in 1946, who was so unpopular he wouldn't even name the plan after him. He asked George Marshall, his Secretary of State, if he could name it after him. But it started out with minimal support in the public. I think it was 18% support in the first Gallup poll. But again, Republicans and Democrats went to work together, and at the end of the day, when that Marshall Plan was put to a vote in the House of Representatives, with a Republican House and a beleaguered Democratic president, there on the two sides of the aisle, two men who stood up. On one side, both freshmen. On one side was Richard Nixon, and on the other was Jack Kennedy. Two freshman members of the House of Representatives. Nixon told me years later, just before he died, he said the point of all of that is one of his proudest moments. He said the point of all of that is when the chips are down, Americans stand up together. When the chips are down, Americans stand up together. And that is where we are now. The chips are down. We've heard that repeatedly now from these various people. Now, what sort of needs to be done here as a political matter? Clearly, there is much continued work to be done on how do you reform Medicare and Medicaid to get the kind of savings. There's a lot of substantive work that needs to be done here, but there needs to be some political work too. Erskine and Allen both talked about leadership. It does require leadership from the President and from the leaders in the House and Senate, and we're seeing some of that. Give credit to President Obama for this. He's getting hit for being too passive, but give credit. He has never taken Social Security off the table. There are Democrats on Capitol Hill who want to take Social Security out of this conversation. And he's never taken it off the table. He's allowed it to remain on the table. He has proposed these freezes and the like. But I must say, if this is going to be done, he's going to have to do more. And I don't think there's any question about that. Nelson Mandela used to talk about leading from in front and leading from behind. And a lot of Mandela's time was spent leading from behind. In some ways, given the toxic environment in which we find ourselves, I don't think it's a surprise the President is trying to lead more from behind. The danger is he's going to lead from the side, and you cannot lead from the side. You've either got to be out in front or you've got to be behind herding people along, but you can't do it from the side. And I do think he's going to have to jump into this more fully and send signals. I want to get beyond this. My hope is that he'll anoint Joe Biden to continue the conversations that he's in now on the CR and take those conversations into the bigger picture, which is coming, so that there is a signal from the White House, we want to invite a bigger conversation now. The conventional wisdom is this White House wants to wait until after the 2012 elections to do the big things, and that there are a lot of people on the Hill who want to wait till after 2012. You've got to change that conversation. You've got to change the conversation and create some momentum. I think momentum creation is very important here. There was a sense when the commission reported we had the window was opening, there was some fresh momentum, and then people walked away from it. We're now starting to get back some momentum again because of the formation of this group, because of the conversation among the Gang of Six and the Senate and others. It's starting to create a little fresh momentum, which is great. There has to be a major public educational campaign here to make this work. With all due respect, I don't think Americans are there yet. The polls certainly are telling politicians they're not there yet. I think that is an educational process. I do think Americans are good-willed enough and sensible enough that when they do understand the facts, they will come around. I do believe that, and I think the educational effort has to be there. I do think there has to be some quiet, serious conversations. It is much harder today in this media environment to hold quiet conversations than it was back in 1983 when you had 3 networks. It's just a much, much tougher deal. But there has to be some sort of respect built up in order to have a joint effort here to make this work. I am very much of the view that if we can get the public to come around, and there are a few people in this town who see that the politics will work for them and are willing to have the courage, a growing number of people will be willing to have the courage, if you could get the White House working with the Senate group that is now emerging, the bipartisan Senate group that's emerging, and quietly see if there is common ground among all of them and take that over to John Boehner and the House, I think that that would be a way possibly to get this done. There are some other political combinations that one could think of, but I do think it's important not to have an air of defeatism about this. Rather to see it has been done in the past, it does take leadership, and we have leadership. And the people who have been speaking up today, there are strong leaders who are now willing to put their hands on this and push. But we know we will need more leadership from the White House, and we will need more leadership, frankly, from folks up here in Capitol Hill. Thank you very much.
And it's a pleasure to be here. I was in the camp of people who was somewhat dubious about this undertaking when it originally got kicked off. You know, the well-worn Washington jadedness about commissions, and was pleasantly surprised with the scope of the plan that was unrolled. The standard semi-cynical view in Washington is that the time we're actually going to address our long-run budget issues is when we have a crisis. And the last giant crisis wasn't the right one, and so we're waiting around for the next good crisis that will get us to fix things. But as several commentators have noted, you know, another alternative is leadership, that leadership can address these issues too. We had back in December what I thought of as sort of 2 wonderful weeks of leadership apparent, where we had plans on the table. We had the plan concocted by these gentlemen and their colleagues on the commission. There's also a somewhat less known plan by the Bipartisan Policy Center, a Domenici-Rivlin plan that was also out there. And there were 2 really good weeks in Washington in which the debates were about competing plans for how you might address the issues. Then those were overtaken by other budgetary events and have fallen off. But I view today as basically another kickoff to try to resuscitate this notion that, you know, the right debate to have is among competing plans. It is too easy for people to pick at plans that are out there when they don't have the burden on them of putting forward their own. And that really what the debate needs to be about are different ways of accomplishing a situation in which the federal budget is under control in the future, so that we can compare alternatives. And so, you know, great kudos to Erskine and Al for getting this plan out there. Just a couple thoughts on the substance. There are obviously lots of issues to go through where one can have strong feelings, both pro and con, in the individual components. But the things that strike me as the key facts, key issues are, first of all, really everything has to be on the table, right? As several other speakers have said, you really need just to put the entire federal budget on the table and start discussing it. And as an analytic budget geek myself, I view that as the right answer in part just purely for analytic reasons. That we're in a situation in which we're spending much more than we have historically. It looks like revenues won't keep up if we keep on our current trajectory. And we have to reprioritize. So we have to look at everything we're doing, decide which of those we can afford to do and how we're going to finance them. And to do that, it makes sense to look at the total panoply of federal activities that are out there. Then in addition, from a political point of view, okay, not my skill set, but just my sense of how politics works, is that ultimately what we're going to be looking for are plans that have shared sacrifice, and that you're going to want to have a plan in which everyone feels like they're giving up something so that the greater good is being accomplished. And again, the best way to accomplish that is to have everything on the table, recognize that there are going to have to be changes on the spending side, going to have to be changes on the revenue side. On the spending side, in this plan, one particular feature I want to highlight are changes to Social Security. There's a debate about whether Social Security should be part of this larger fiscal discussion. I'm strongly in the camp that it should. If you look at the plans that have been put forward, they tend to have the attribute, both this plan and the Bipartisan Policy Center one, they tend to have a structure in which, to a rough approximation, they try to address Social Security as a standalone budget entity. Right, so getting them more or less in a situation where the revenues coming in are going to cover the spending in the future, obviously along with what's been accumulated in the trust fund. But that doesn't mean to me that they can really be separated out and treated as an entirely separate undertaking. That ultimately the resources that are going to be used for those programs are coming out of the larger economy and have to be considered when we're thinking about the rest of the federal budget. And then in addition, there's just the matter of time. that most of the changes you would want to make to Social Security are changes you want to happen in the future, that you want to have an opportunity to phase in over time. And so even though the worst of the problems of Social Security are well out in the future, it makes sense to address them sooner rather than later so that you can get the policy changes in place and so you can let people adjust to them as they plan for the future. Then quickly on the tax side. I actually think the tax side is, so obviously I work in an organization that thinks about taxes, so you'll forgive me for talking my book and saying I think the tax side is in some sense the most interesting conceptually in the plan. The more and more I've thought about our tax system, the more and more frustrated I've been that I think we're confusing ourselves in the way we use the numbers that we usually use to characterize the tax system. And I think the report from the Commission does a good job of highlighting some of the issues that we face in just communicating and understanding what we do with our tax system. The tax system is clearly broken. It's too complicated. It's not fair. It doesn't raise enough money. It's incredibly inefficient. No sentient being would design a tax code anything like the tax code we have today. And so thing one is that including fundamental tax reform as part of a proposal I think makes enormous sense just as a way to give some benefit to people who otherwise are also going to see spending go down and revenues go up. At least give people a better tax code as a silver lining in this process, as well as obviously getting the debt under control. But in addition, once you start looking underneath our tax system, one of the things you discover is that we do an enormous amount of social policy through the tax code, that we have deductions, exclusions, exemptions, credits, all sorts of programs that are trying to guide people's behavior, either explicitly or by accident, by kind of historical buildup of these provisions. And that when you look at them closely, a very large number of them actually look enormously like spending programs. It's just that in Washington, it is much easier to get something enacted if you structure it as a tax cut rather than as spending. If you structure it as a tax cut, you get to portray yourself as someone who's cutting taxes and accomplishing some social goal, whereas if you structure it as spending, that's something that basically polls less well. And from my point of view, one of the things the report does a good job of highlighting is that if you look in the tax code, there are a lot of things in there that look like spending programs in disguise, and that it makes sense to think about rolling those back in a way they'll be scored as increasing revenues, and they will appear to be tax increases, and from an official budget scoring point of view, they are. But from a practical economic budget point of view, they look enormously like part of the effort to reduce spending. And I think one of the communication challenges, and again the report I think does a good job of trying to highlight this communication issue, is that some of those things that result in higher revenues really should be thought of as reducing overall spending. And it's not just loopholes, it's not just special interest provisions, but if you think about the mortgage interest deduction, if you think about the exclusion for health insurance, think about a whole large number of other things that are called tax expenditures, that many of them deserve sort of extra special scrutiny as we go through this process. Thanks.
Thank you. Jeff?
Thank you. On the plane ride down this morning, I actually reread the entire report, and it's really an extraordinary document. It lays out principles for addressing this problem. It lays out a framework of 6 buckets of policy changes that need to occur, and then it has just dozens of very thoughtful, specific proposals about how to address our fiscal situation. And I'd like to urge all of the people in the room here who've only read the commentaries on the report, coming either from the left and the right, complaining about features of it, to actually read the report. It's really an important document, and I'd like to encourage people to take advantage of the hard work that all the people who worked on that commission did and benefit from that. It's fashionable to criticize our political system for being unable to deal with long-term challenges. But the truth is that our political leaders have risen to the challenge, I think, more often than they're given credit for. We've known for, I guess, 35 years at least, that the current decade was going to be a fiscally challenging one as the baby boomers retired and as spending therefore on health care and retirement benefits went up. And our country started preparing for this ahead of time. In 1983, we passed legislation explicitly predicated on the proposition that we should pay down the debt in advance of the baby boomers retiring. The Clinton era Save Social Security First policies were based on the same idea. And those movements had an effect. Between 1993 and 2001, debt as a share of GDP fell from 49% to 33%, in large part because of the 2 actions I just mentioned, but also because Congress and various administrations did hard work in 1990 and 1993 and in 1996 in various budget acts. So it really is the case that our system has taken action to deal with fiscal challenges in the past, and I think those episodes serve as a guide and as I think a hopeful sign that we can do what needs to be done now. It's also the case that the economic crisis of the last couple of years could have been an excuse to do nothing about our fiscal situation and basically ignore our long-term fiscal challenges. But instead, Congress and the President tackled the #1 driver of our long-term fiscal challenges, health care costs, and the Affordable Care Act contains most of the best ideas from across the political spectrum for controlling healthcare costs, and that was enacted at a time when it would have been easy to ignore these kind of long-term issues. And then similarly, the President and Congress came together to form this commission, the Deficit Commission, and to start working on these problems together. So I think there's a lot of hopeful signs that our political system actually is capable of dealing with these challenges. The Deficit Commission report has, I think, transformed the policy debate in 4 important ways. First, it's made it absolutely clear that there are no painless solutions to our fiscal challenges. No one can stand up with a straight face today in Washington and say waste, fraud, and abuse is going to get rid of all of our problems. And this report has performed an important service by showing us exactly what kind of things it's going to take to achieve fiscal sustainability. It's also, I think, made it quite clear that revenue levels are going to have to rise from the levels that would exist if we fully extended the 2001-2003 tax cuts. Raising revenues to the Fiscal Commission threshold of 21% in the medium term will go a long way towards stabilizing the debt to GDP level, although my guess is that it's going to be important to go above that level in future decades. The third thing the Commission did is to provide a politically feasible route to achieving these revenue increases by focusing people's attention on the tax expenditures in the tax code and the fact that there's basically a way to simultaneously cut spending and raise revenue, which is to go after tax expenditures. And fourth, the Commission made it clear that we're going to have to keep tackling health care costs if we're going to make progress against the budget deficit, that we're going to have to not only fully implement the Affordable Care Act well and achieve the cost savings that has laid the infrastructure for, but we're going to have to double down on the Affordable Care Act cost savings provisions and go further to control health care costs. There are some people who would say that we should basically put off our dealing with these fiscal adjustments until we're further along toward the economic, in achieving the economic recovery. I think that would be a big mistake. First, demonstrating that our country has its fiscal house in order is going to be an important part, I think, to accelerating the economic recovery. That every day investors around the world are trying to decide whether to put their money in the US or in some other country. And if we show that our country is going to be a good place to do business, that we're a country that's behaving like grown-ups, they're going to be more likely to put their money in our country. And if they're investing in our country, that's going to create the capital stock that's going to make our workers more productive and make their wages higher. So I think, first of all, that it's important to our economic recovery that we act soon to deal with our fiscal challenge. Second, every month that we fail to deal with our fiscal challenge, we're basically rolling the dice on whether our creditors will continue to lend to us at current interest rates. And if we keep playing this risky game, sooner or later we're going to roll snake eyes. And we're going to have a much more painful fiscal adjustment forced upon us than the one that we can accomplish now. Third, a big part of what we're going to need to do to address our long-term fiscal imbalances is to change our social insurance programs. And because people make life plans based on the form of these programs, it's only fair that we make these changes up front and give people plenty of time to adjust. And so acting now is the right way to go in dealing with the changes that are going to have to happen to our retirement and our health programs. And finally, I would argue that if we don't stabilize the financing of our social insurance programs by coming up with additional revenues and additional cost containment, all of the rest of the government is going to be gobbled up by these programs. And that's going to threaten all the other important things that government does, whether it's education, infrastructure, R&D, all of the other things the government does. And so I think it's important to act now to prevent that from happening. So I guess I want to emphasize that there's really no tension between maintaining the fiscal stimulus we need to have in the economy for the next year or two and simultaneously enacting changes to be implemented 3 to 5 years from now that deal with our medium-term and long-term fiscal imbalances. We can do both of those things right now. So overall, I simply want to say the Deficit Commission has done a tremendous public service by laying out a framework of working together in a bipartisan way. And I think we're in a position to do what we did in 1983 and 1990 and 1993 and 1996, which is to make serious progress against budget deficits.
Well, thank you very much. You guys want to say anything in response?
Yeah, I'd like to just say just a couple of things. First of all, in response to what David said, the politics are really, really tough. No question about it. And the politics are tough because the problems are real. The problems are real, the solutions are all painful, and there is no easy way out. And it's going to take leadership from both houses of Congress, from both parties, and from the president for us to get this done. I agree with David that the president has to lead from either the front or the back, but I can tell you that you need to do this and see this as a process. Not only did we have a process that David talked about in 1983, but in 1996 when we negotiated the first balanced budget in a generation, I had to spend months and months locked up in conference rooms with Newt Gingrich and Trent Lott, and y'all owe me a lot for that. But that's the way it gets done. You know, you have to listen to the other side, you have to find out where they are, and then you have to come together with a common sense plan where everybody makes some sacrifice. In response to what Don said, the question to him was, is this a good starting point? I can tell you what, if we wait, we're not going to have to wait long. This crisis is coming. As Dave Cody said, this is not just a problem for our children and grandchildren. This is a problem for us. And we're going to have to deal with it, or the bond market is going to deal with it for us. I agree. Our conclusion was when we looked at this subject about whether you should separate Social Security or separate revenue, we came to the conclusion that everything has to be on the table. The reason is we can't grow our way out of this problem. We could have double-digit growth for the next 2 decades and not solve this problem. We can't solely tax our way out of this problem. Raising taxes doesn't do a darn thing to solve the demographic problem or the fact that health care is growing at a faster rate than GDP. And even if you wanted to solve it with taxes only, you'd have to raise the highest marginal rate to 70%. You'd have to raise the corporate rate to 80%. You'd have to raise the capital gains and dividend rate to 50%. And then that's a country that nobody wants to start or grow a business. You can't do it with taxes alone. And we can't simply cut our way out of this problem. If you look again at the numbers and then you listen to what people say on the television, you think they're in 2 different worlds. These people that say, oh gosh, well let's solve this with just cuts, but let's exclude Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. And for goodness sake, let's exclude defense because we have to stay safe and secure. And of course, we have to pay the interest on our debt. Well, if you exclude all those things, you have to cut everything else by about 75%. It just can't happen. And that's why we fought so hard to put together a realistic plan, as Don said, that was based on, but Jeff said it's based on 6 basic principles. And I want you to know what those principles are because I think they're the key in this education plan that we're undertaking here to understand what we're trying to do. The first principle was we didn't want to do anything that would destroy a very fragile economic recovery. That's why we don't get back to 2008 levels of spending in real terms till 2013. You could do it in 2012, which is what the Republicans are talking about today, but we were afraid that might disrupt what is a very fragile economic recovery. So we made the tough choices, and we tell you how we're going to pay for every single one of these cuts, but we were afraid to do it in 2012. We waited to 2013. Second principle was We truly wanted to protect the truly disadvantaged. That's why if you look at our Social Security plan, you know, we give a bump up to people on Social Security between the ages of 81 and 86 because that's when every economist from the right and left told us they needed it. We also raised the minimum payment to 125% of poverty. Obviously, to pay for that, it made our job more difficult, but we thought it was the right thing to do if you really want to protect the truly disadvantaged. The third principle was we wanted to be safe and secure. That's something that America counts on the federal government to do. But that doesn't mean that we have to spend more than the next 14 largest countries put together on our national defense. I don't believe America can afford to be the world's policeman. I think we are bearing a disproportionate amount of the responsibility. Safe and secure, but let's make some reasonable changes. Fourth, you know, if we're going to be competitive in what is today a knowledge-based global economy, we better invest in education and infrastructure and high-value research. But it also means you can do it wisely. Having just stepped down as the president of the University of North Carolina, which is a 17-university system, I can assure you that every dollar that the federal government spends on research is not spent wisely. We have 3,000 universities that have 375,000 research projects going on today. We have 375,000 research projects that are going on 3,000 different universities today. Now, some of that research, although it doesn't lead to success, stops you from going down a wrong path for somebody who leads to success. So it's not all bad just because it fails, but I can guarantee you all of it is not high value added research. And that's one of the areas we can look at and we can make smart decisions because we live in a time of limited resources. Fifth, we did want to reform the tax code. I think the whole argument about the Bush tax cuts, keep them or not keep them, is not the right argument. What we want to talk about is broadening the base, simplifying the code, getting rid of the spending in the tax code, and using the resources predominantly to bring down rates and to reduce the deficit. And if we did that, we have $1.1 trillion of spending in the tax code. And it's just, we called it, Al and I called it tax earmarks. And we spend all our time here in Washington talking about earmarks. Well, the earmarks in the spending part of the income statement are just $16 billion a year. This is $1.1 trillion worth of spending that's in the tax code. You know, and it's just spending by another name. If you get rid of it, you can take marginal rates to 8% up to $70,000, 14% up to $210,000, and 23% can be the maximum tax rate. You can take the corporate rate to 26%, and you can go to a territorial system, and overnight America becomes the best place to start and grow a business. The last thing we have to do is we truly do have to cut spending. There's no question about it. And we have to cut spending wherever we find it. All the discussion today is about cutting domestic discretionary spending. That's a crazy way to go about this. And just to put it in perspective, you know, the Democrats are talking about $10.5 billion worth of spending cuts, and the Republicans are talking about $61 billion worth of spending cuts. Sounds like a lot, but when you put it in the context of a $3.7 trillion budget, it means we're only talking about spending cuts of 1.6%. I can cut my budget tonight 1.6%. The problem is it's coming out of a very small part of a pie, and it has a disproportionately adverse effect on a number of people. So what we have to do is broaden the discussion. We have to talk about cuts within the context of not just the domestic non-defense budget, but the domestic discretionary defense budget, the entitlements, the other mandatory spending, and the tax code. And if we do that in a plan like ours, you can reduce the deficit by $4 trillion over this next decade. You can take the debt to GDP ratio to 65% by 2020, to 60% by 2023. You can cut the deficit in half by 2015, down to 2.3% of GDP, and to 1.2% by 2020, and eventually get it to balance. And if we do that, all this gloom and doom, I promise you, goes away, and the future of this country will be absolutely as bright as it possibly can be.
You see what's happened to me? He dragged me along through this enthusiastic thing that he does. And I just say, my God, Bowles. But we've come a long way. We're really well known. We went to a studio yesterday in New York, and they gave us a tag, and mine said John Simpson, his said Erskine Bowles. So people are aware of us. It was. But let me thank this panel. Appreciate that so much. Appreciate your being here. Dave Gergen, I went up to Harvard and taught for 4 spring semesters. I couldn't have got into Harvard if I'd picked the locks. And there I was, and I never graduated cum laude. I graduated thank the laude. And it was such a treat to be up there with Dave and Mickey, the congressman from Mickey Edwards and Roger Porter, a great bunch. Let me just say a couple of things, but first, as I say, thank you. We almost felt like we were the gang who knew too much. We learned things that are unknown to the American people, but we know how untouchable they are. Let me just name a couple. We haven't talked about the defense budget. Social Security solvency is a lot different than Social Security cutting. But I'm convinced that if you can't get Social Security solvency embraced and in the statute books, you can't do anything with Medicare, Medicaid, and defense. If you can't do the easy one, which is Social Security solvency, you'll never get to the tough ones. Here are a couple examples. The defense, and when you get to defense, you see you're talking about, you know, defense is security and safety and all the things that Americans demand of this amazing system, which is bigger than 14 countries, other countries' worth of their defense. We asked about how many contractors do you have in the Defense Department, and they said between 1 million and 10 million. We said, well, do they come back after they reincarnate themselves, after they've defeated, you know, or gotten their money and left? Well, yes, they do. They get a new name and they come back, and that's fascinating. So we just cut out 250,000 of them in our recommendation. Conrad said for 10 years he's been asking for an audit of the Defense Department. Finally, they just said, our department is unauditable. The Defense Department is unauditable. You can't find out, you can't get into, you can't dig the figures, there's no way to do it. There are 1,000 bases still in Asia and Europe, 1,000. I was there at the end of the Army of Occupation in 55, 56. There's no need to have those huge number of bases in Europe and Asia, so we suggested cutting those back. That'll have to be a BRAC thing to go through to get that done. But there was one that stands out. There is a healthcare system within the Department of Defense. It's called TRICARE. It is separate from the Veterans Administration. It's separate from health care of any kind. It applies to 2.2 million Americans who are military retirees. Now, hang on. Don't get your hat on yet. I am a veteran. I'm a lifetime member of the VFW and the American Legion. We looked at that, and you can be a military retiree. I was 2 years active, 6 or 8 years reserve. A few more years of reserve, I would be a retired military personnel. You could accumulate those things through National Guard or reserves, maybe combat, maybe not. Many were not. But the premium for the health care is $470 a year with no copay. And it applies to your dependents. And it costs $53 billion a year. We said to Gates, how come you couldn't raise that to $4,700 a year? Maybe that'd be pretty fair. He said, are you kidding? Man, the veterans organizations tear us to shreds. We people served. We gave up our families. We disrupted our lives. That's all true. We all did that. But I'll tell you, when you get into stuff like that, and wait till we come to that little gem, we'll get ripped. The savagery hadn't even started. It's when it gets close. When it gets close to they actually read that this TRICARE, they're going to have to pay maybe $5,000 a year for a premium, maybe $500 copay, and maybe get Uncle Charlie out of the game. You're going to just rip and snort. And the violin music will start. You ain't seen nothing yet. So that's why I say we have a long haul here, but we knew that when we started, and we ain't quitting. We will not stop because this thing will not go away. It is impossible to get rid of it because when the crush comes, they'll say, what the hell do we do here? Well, they say a bunch of nuts put together something, 18 of them, and 11 of the goofy guys voted for it, and it's all in there in English in 67 pages. And that's where it is, and you can't escape it. And so if we have missed anyone, contact us. And we will put you in the game because we have succeeded beyond our fondest expectations. We have reached the zenith for me of life at 79 to have achieved the ability to piss off everyone in the United States. God bless us each and every one.
So it's pretty clear to me that the reason that we are stuck with such a large deficit and have had such difficulty in closing it is that we have had a shortage of good metaphors and one-liners. And the social utility of Alan Simpson is to provide a steady stream of laugh lines in a very sad story. So for that, Senator, we thank you.
Thank you, David.
You did a very good job of anticipating many of the questions of the audience, but I think a number of questions revolved around some of the basic decisions in the plan, which are, among others, it's essentially $3 of spending cuts for $1 of revenue increases achieved by the way Erskine Bowles described, by getting rid of deductions and credits and so forth. And I wondered if Don and Jeff could talk a little bit about, does that seem like a good ratio? The Rivlin-Domenici thing was more 50-50. How do you look at this, and what's the right way to think about this? Do you want to start, Jeff?
Sure. I guess I mean, first of all, I'm going to start quibbling about some things in the plan, but I couldn't come up with a plan that would get 11 votes. So it's easy to complain about things and get my own only my own vote. So I don't at all mean to trivialize what they've accomplished here. I guess when I look at the balance, how I look at it is, they set a target for revenues around 21% of GDP. I think we should try to get there somewhat faster than their plan does, and the reason is because I don't think we're going to achieve all of the spending cuts that they have in the plan. The Social Security reforms have almost no impact on the deficit in the first decade because they ramp up slowly. They're sort of 0.2, 0.3% of GDP in the first decade, and the prospect of us as a country doing more on health care right now, I think it would be terrific if we did, but I'm not that optimistic that we're going to get all the spending cuts done that they propose in this report. So I think we need some cushion, and I think the way to have some cushion is to get to the revenue target a little faster. I guess I'd also
when you say that, you mean get to from where we are today to 21% in shorter number of years.
Get there in, say, 4 years rather than in 12 years or something like that. The other thing I would say is I think the discretionary caps are too tight, and I think that's not only a substantive judgment, but it's a political judgment. I think what we saw in the 90s is when we set realistic discretionary caps, they held, and when we started writing artificial ones that there is no chance in hell of meeting, Congress just ignored them. And, discretionary spending in the 5 years before the recession averaged 7.6% of GDP. The president's budget over this decade would take that number down to about 6% of GDP, so from 7.6 down to 6. So a very dramatic cut in discretionary spending as a share of GDP. The Commission plan goes further all the way down to 5.3% of GDP, and I think that's both too low to actually get followed, and I also think it's too low substantively. I think it would involve us cutting things that we shouldn't cut.
Don?
Oh, thanks. There's an interesting academic literature that looks across the world, across nations, something, by the way, I think is beneficial for the U.S. to do. I think we have a lot to learn from experiences in the rest of the world. And I would characterize, so it looks at budget changes that have been done under difficult budget circumstances in other nations. And I would say a general reading of that literature suggests that budget reforms that focus more heavily on spending reductions than tax increases, on average across nations, seem to be more successful and to have less detrimental effects on the economy. That said, there is another communication problem with this notion about how do you talk about, $3 of spending cuts, $1 tax increase. A, there's the issue about how you think about tax expenditures. B, there's this issue about what your baseline is. Right? One of the things that unfortunately has happened in American fiscal policy is that the notion of a baseline, of what we compare policies to going out in the future, has become basically unmoored. In my job, we often analyze tax proposals for various organizations, and late last year, people were down to the point where they were asking us to use 6 different baselines to compare changes to, which becomes basically unusable. And so there's an issue about how you even calculate these kind of 3 and 1 numbers. So I tend to focus more now on thinking about the level, the size of government that you're going to end up with, rather than the changes. And there, as David suggested in his question, there's a significant difference between where this plan ends up in size of government. It is in rough terms 21% of GDP on the spending and revenue side, versus the Domenici-Rivlin plan, which ends up in rough orders of magnitude to be around 23% of GDP. Again, there's some issues about how those numbers are calculated. But I think actually one of the very important debates we have to have in the United States is just to go back to first principles and ask, what is it that we want our government to do? And then design a way to finance it. In the Bipartisan Policy Center effort that ended up with a larger government, there was a decision that in essence over time the government would be spending more, and a decision was made to finance that, if you run through the numbers, basically by introducing a value-added tax. And that was one of the trade-offs that the group confronted. Right? The proposal we're talking about today ended up with a smaller government, at least over the next several decades. And that's, we've got to have a healthy debate about which of those is what Americans actually want.
David, there are 2 questions here that go, I think, to the issue of, is there something different about our time that makes it harder to do things? It basically refers, I think, back to your comments on the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan compromises. How do you bring together politicians who are interested in obviously being reelected, and this requires doing things that are unpopular? And is there something about the lack of friendship, camaraderie on the Hill now that makes this much harder than in an earlier era?
I think all of us are aware that there's been a deterioration of the political culture in this city and increasingly across the nation over in recent years, and that just in the nature of things in this city, people used to bring their families here. They used to have their kids go to school together. They went to the same churches together. They went to the same synagogues together, and there was more bonding that has occurred. And I think all of us have decried sort of the hollowing out of the middle. But I must say, I do think at the same time, there are some reasons to be hopeful. When Mark Warner comes here to the Senate as he has, and reaches out as he has, and gets Saxby Chambliss to go to Richmond as they went to yesterday, I think that, and to be able to have the trust in each other, then to do home-and-home visits, to me was encouraging. I thought it said something that was going on that was important. Senator Durbin just walked in. Now, many people have sort of typecast Senator Durbin. He's never going to buy into any of this. But like Tom Coburn, he decided it was more important for the country. So I don't think we should be entirely pessimistic about this. And in fact, I think there are some rays of hope that some things are going on now. We got a little kindling, and this is, you guys are sort of reigniting this, and I think that's terrific. I do want to say one thing, if I might just add one word here. What's going to happen in the next few weeks And to those of you who are here as valuable members of staff for the Senate and the House, what happens in the next few weeks is going to not only be important in terms of the continuing resolution and the debt ceiling, but it's going to be important for the environment in which other things take place. So that if these become sort of debates in which people are demonize and demonize each other and sort of poison the waters, it's going to be much, much tougher to go on to the bigger issues which are just over the horizon. So that I hope that I would appeal to you, if we can somehow get through these next weeks on the continuing resolution and on the debt ceiling, I think that it can set the tone for a much more constructive and positive approach to climbing the higher mountains that are out there just over in the distance.
Thank you. We're going to end the panel here. I know there are a lot of questions, but we're lucky to have a couple more senators to hear from. I want to end by reading one question that doesn't require any answer, but I think it speaks to the issue directly. Why isn't debt reduction a signature issue among young people, the way the Vietnam War was? They are the people most personally affected. I'm sorry, Senator Simpson, but he thinks we need some young pop star to get the message out. With that, our very own pop stars, Senator Durbin, the podium is yours.
Pop star? I don't know about that. Thank you. Thank you for being here and for launching this effort. And a special thanks to my great friends Alan Simpson, Erskine Bowles, and David. Thank you for your kind words. I have been asked a lot of questions about my vote in favor of the Fiscal Commission's report and the fact that somehow or another my political profile stood out. But I want to say in fairness that it was a report that, though I disagreed with some particulars, I thought really came at a right moment in history. There have been a great number of these commissions that have issued reports that have gone unnoticed and gathered dust somewhere, if we still gather dust on books around here. And this was different. And it was different primarily because it started with an inspiring idea that came from two senators, Kent Conrad and Judd Gregg, which they had crafted into a piece of legislation which would have been even more effective exercise. But when that failed, they pressed on with President Obama to create this commission, which was, I guess, singularly doomed from the start, since it needed 14 out of 18 people to agree on anything in Washington, which is hard to imagine. But having said that, the extraordinary efforts of our co-chairs made it happen, literally made it happen. They were patient to a fault with Bruce Reed and other staff assistants, listening to all of our inspired ideas as we senators and congressmen demonstrated to our public members and to anyone who would listen how we each had the best plan for shaping up Western civilization. And that went on for about 10 months. And then at the end of it, they prepared a rough draft and presented it to us and waited for reaction. And after that draft elicited the reaction, they then came forward and gave us a final draft, take it or leave it, which is different than the way things are done around here. You usually get a chance to amend things to death, and we didn't. It was basically a take it or leave it. And I took it, and I'm glad I did. And I think it was the right thing to do, because it has resulted in a national conversation which this operation will continue, and one which we need to continue. I come from the left side of the spectrum. Back in the day, they called us liberals. We're now progressives, I guess. Maybe I'm both. But what I said when I voted for it was that I felt that people from my side of the political spectrum needed to be at this table to talk about the future, because the things that I consider very critical and important, a safety net for the most vulnerable people in America, making certain that we have a progressive tax system in our country, making certain that we have spending that reflects investments in opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't have them, need to be protected at the table for the negotiating. That's why I voted for it, so I would be part of that. I will tell you, at the end of the day, I didn't realize how quickly we would be engaged to use these ideas in a practical way. Now let me tell you an aside, a story that goes back to my service in the House of Representatives, Mark. And I was second term, and I was on the House Appropriations Committee, and the chairman was Jamie Whitten. Jamie Whitten came to the United States House of Representatives from Mississippi and sat on the floor when Franklin Roosevelt delivered the Day of Infamy speech, 1941. And by the time that I met Chairman Whitten and was a member of his committee in 1985, 44 years later, I went to him and asked him if I could be the appropriations member on the House Budget Committee, since appropriations assigned a couple members to that committee. And he said, "Why do you want to be on the Budget Committee?" And I said, well, I think it'd be good because they kind of make the blueprints for spending, and then the Appropriations Committee and others follow. And he said, well, if you want to be on it, you can be on it. He says, but I want you to remember one thing. He said, the Budget Committee deals in hallucinations, and the Appropriations Committee deals in facts. Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I went to the Budget Committee. He was not too far off. So now we are taking not hallucinations, but ideas and trying to bring them down to the concrete world of reality. Mark and I will be meeting again this afternoon with Kent Conrad and Mike Crapo and Tom Coburn and Saxby Chambliss, an unlikely gathering, talking about taking the concepts from this deficit commission and moving them forward. And to make a fine point on what David has said, we are captives and victims, if you will, of election cycles. I don't think it's any surprise that there was more support coming out of the Senate for this deficit commission than the House. I don't think it's any surprise that the follow-on is coming out of the Senate. The Founding Fathers did have a pretty good idea. We have 6-year terms, and we can think in terms beyond the next November election when House members can't. They face the reality of re-election almost immediately. So now we're in the middle of this maelstrom over the continuing resolution for the rest of this year, and we're trying to think about the next year and the following 10 years. And what we're discussing, it's not easy. As good as the work was in this commission, this is not easy. And there are many differences, even within this room. And I'd have to say a very positive attitude and environment in trying to find solutions. We may fail. I've got to be honest with you. We may not make it. But I hope we succeed, because I think there's an historic and moral imperative to succeed. I believe that we've got to come to grips with this situation for the good of this country. The one thing I said on the day that I voted for this commission report was that I'd received a phone call from my son that morning. He's 40 years old, and he said, "Dad, I'm proud of you. Thanks for doing this." Best reward any politician can ever have, that his son, who he thinks he's brought up in the right democratic tradition, understands that this issue is part of our future. Thank you for what you're doing with this follow-on. And Erskine and Alan, thank you again for your leadership. It made a big difference for our nation. Appreciate it.
Senator Warner, before you came in, I described this as the first time I'd been to a revival in the Senate. Do you want to give us the benediction?
I'm not sure I'd call this a full benediction, but I would say, echoing David, thank you for your kind comments. You know, I got an email today from my 21-year-old daughter, and she doesn't like much of anything I do in politics, but this was kind of a, "Dad, I'm proud of you as well," approach following some of the stories that were today. And one of the things that we've not done is translate this debate from a bunch of numbers and dire financial consequences into the fact that unless we can get our country's balance sheet right, we're not going to be able to create the jobs, the growth, the innovation that each of our preceding generations had. And you know, as a new guy here, I want to thank Alan and Erskine and all the members, you know, and particularly folks like Dick Durbin and Tom Coburn, who kind of had to find that common ground across perhaps even a larger bridge that got us here. And what Saxby Chambliss and I decided was we weren't going to try to let this effort go to waste. And if there's 2 or 3 lessons as a new guy that I've learned, is that one, the current debate around the CR, as important as it is, pales in comparison to this effort. And that for those of us who feel that there are certain programs now under assault, that you will never get there if your whole debate is around 12% of the budget, which is domestic discretionary spending. And I think there is a growing recognition that we have to broaden the discussion, number one. Number two, if you're going to do something big, because everybody has applauded what Alan Erskine's done, but there is something in that report for everyone to hate. And the only way you get something big done that puts cuts, revenues, tax reform, all on the table is if it's bipartisan. And I just fundamentally believe there is nothing intellectually better about a bipartisan solution, but for the fact that the American people hire us, and for bipartisan has become code for it must be in the country's interest, not a particular partisan's interest. And it is so important that I think here out of the Senate we try to keep that effort alive. And the third is, and this is to the Hill members and to the business leaders and others, one of the things that we've got to do, and Dave Cody is here from Honeywell, we need all those who are saying, atta boy or atta girl, do more than say that, but to actually put their names on the line as well. We can't do this without business community support that then says, well, by the way, we want lower rates, but you can't touch my tax expenditure. Or the more descriptive efforts that Alan Simpson kind of gives about different groups who say, we want to do our part, but as long as you don't touch mine. Unless there's a little shared sacrifice, unless there's a little bit of everybody having skin in the game, we're not going to get there. If we do get there, it will be because of the leadership of folks like Dick Durbin. I absolutely believe we will. I think this is that moment in time. I think this is the issue of our time, not just financially. National security is, as Chairman Mullen has said, but also about Dick's kids, my kids, and all of these young people here, making sure they have the same kind of opportunities that we had coming up in this country. So we got to get it done. This group and the formation of this support group to take on all the established interests who will at the front end will say yes, but when we get to the details, we'll say, hold on here. We desperately need this group's success, and thank you all for stepping up. Thank you very much.
I just want to close with one story to show you what kind of silly mess we've got ourselves in and why this is both a national security and an economic security problem. As you all know, we have a treaty with Taiwan that if they're invaded by China, we have to defend them. The only problem with that is we have to borrow the money from China to do it.
I love that.
Thank you very much for coming.